Welcome, Robin. We respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And as we welcome you, Robin, our thoughts also go out to the people in India, where we have families, friends, and colleagues as they battle the virus right now. And to our audiences who are listening to us Zoom in, a very warm welcome to you, Robin. I hope you've been well.
Thanks for inviting me, Sanjay. Yes, and I echo what you've just been saying about thoughts going out to friends in India. It's not a happy time. Everything that comes in this morning on email is not particularly heartwarming in that sense. It's not very good news.
That's true. I think we've been just, it's a barrage of, information about friends and family, which is so difficult to take. Yeah.
Yeah.
But on to something slightly more, more specific to our conversation here today. Robin, a few years ago, you wrote this wonderful book that you and Asidoron wrote this wonderful book, Waste of a Nation. And first of all, it was such a great pun on wealth of a nation. Can you tell us what prompted the book and how did you do fieldwork? How did you find linkages between consumption and waste?
The book originated really in the silly ways that these things do. When we were finishing research for a book about mobile phones, which we did in 2013, Asi and I, and he's an anthropologist, of course. And he went, when we were finishing the mobile phone book, we thought we needed to know what happened to old mobile phones when they died, because even 10, 11 years ago, that was beginning to become a very noticeable problem, and also an opportunity for kabariwalas who worked in the technology industry. So Asi went out to Selampur, the Delhi suburb, to see what was happening to the electronic goods out there. And he came back that day saying, we've got to write a book about garbage. I said, whatever do we want to write about garbage for? And he said, and then he described seeing little kids with a kerosene burner, that, the kind of burner we cook meals on when there's nothing else, or in Australia, they take on camping trips. A kerosene burner, a saucepan, and half a dozen mobile phones in it being heated so that the plastic would melt and the little fingers could go in and pull out the circuit boards and put them in a pile of circuit boards while they disassembled the phone and then put the plastic over there. So they were doing what every waste management operator would love to have done, that is, having the waste segregated for recycling. But they were doing it in the most awful conditions with all those wonderful toxic fumes rising out of melting plastic. So from there, we kind of got interested. He convinced me that this was, this thing is worth looking at. And as we got into it, of course, it became an absolute obsession. It still is, in a way. I still follow Australian waste management closely and kind of know, when I say closely, I'm always interested in where a new management plant is coming up. There's a big new one out in the western suburbs of Sydney, just about to have a gala opening and so on. So that's where it began, in those sort of strange ways that, questions put themselves in front of you, and then you feel you've got to have a shot at trying to answer them or deal with them.
But you would admit that waste management in India is a particularly difficult thing, in the sense that it's a country that's urbanizing very quickly, and you have urban centers where waste management is not the best. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you see it working out in the future in India? What's happening with waste management?
Well, I think it varies hugely, because there's a patchwork, or in our experience now, I must say, I'm now getting on for 3 years out of date on actually being on the ground following waste questions in India. The book came out 3 years ago. But our findings our discovery was that there's a wonderful patchwork of individual groups, both local government areas and NGOs, doing wonderful work in waste management in particular areas. But the terrible difficulty is in upscaling those so that they cover great cities and whole states. Now, that would be true, of course, in Australia too, but of course, when you're dealing with 25 million people in a country as large as Australia, that's the population of Delhi. So it's a very different matter of scale. But the advantages that India has, I think, are that there is labor available to do the segregation that does allow you to make the most of things people throw away. But that's often at the cost of the health and well-being of the people doing that work. The real trick is to find ways in which you use that labor in ways that aren't utterly degrading and pay a fair remuneration to the people doing the work. And some of the best of the programs, both for efficiency in coverage, that is, for actually cleaning up places, and in providing a decent return to the people who do the real hands-on horrible work, are some of the NGOs around the country. But they're limited, and they make only a tiny impact on the kinds of needs that 1,400 million people put on any sort of waste management system.
Yeah, I'll just take it back to something that you mentioned a little earlier, that that at the bottom of the waste management pyramid, if you like, there isn't much dignity of labor there. And I don't know if you've been following popular media and movies since your book came out. Immediately after your book came out, now there's been this Netflix series called Sacred Games, which begins with the villain, if you like, of the piece, saying that, well, there is wealth in garbage. And I thought he was signaling that when he's been reading your book.
Yes, but it would be nice if he had.
But it is true that there is a lot of there's a lot of things that actually come out from this discussion on waste management that has to do so much with caste and other matters. But while we're on the subject of media, that's Robin, we've read you late 90s and thereabouts as someone who's worked on the media very centrally in India. So can you now reflect 2.5 decades on, as to how India has transformed on that front from the days when you did your field work?
Well, again, it's sort of how one's research interests go from one thing to another. I was always interested in newspapers and, wrote about newspapers. And in 2001, when the book about Indian language newspapers came out, that was just when the mobile phone business was beginning to take off. And that's when I became interested in mobile phones, because clearly they were going to transform the media industry. And that led to the later book that Assi and I did on the mobile phone. So obviously the digital world has changed the news gathering and news presentation business completely. It's some would say it's democratized it, but others would say it has trivialized it to the point where there is no possibility of ascertaining facts or truth, because everybody has their own facts because they have their own phone. And I think there's not much one can do to combat that at the moment, but it is regrettable that any drunk in an Australian pub can become a national broadcaster if he's tweeting and says something sufficiently outrageous. And that applies, of course, everywhere in the world. So the industry has changed, and of course, as we know, it has made it terribly difficult for the old print on paper-based news organizations to survive, particularly at the lower level. I mean, the great institutions, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, probably the Guardian, the BBC, These are global institutions, and there are enough wealthy people in the world who will keep those sorts of institutions going. But it is the local newspaper, and that was what so fascinated me with the explosion of Indian language newspapers from the 1980s, was that wonderful emphasis on local news. Now, some of it may have been terribly trashy and made up, and all the things we know that journos do. There's nothing particularly pure and holy about the old-fashioned journalist. There was never a golden age of journalism. There was a kind of gilded age, which scraped off pretty quickly when you had a deep look. But nevertheless, at its very best, the people who practiced news gathering had some ideals which they clung to. So the difference now is, how do you support news organizations in this age where everyone is making their own news? In Australia, you may have seen there's just been legislation passed that forces the big boys, Google and Facebook, to do deals with local news providers. But the deal is a rather interesting one, because it's gauged to most benefit Rupert Murdoch, and it's the Murdoch pressures that have really generated the legislation, because Murdoch controls so much of news in Australia, certainly in daily newspaper terms. The attempt will be interesting. Facebook and so on, I think, have been prepared to go along with this, because it's really small potatoes in their budgetary terms. But what I think is important, it is an attempt to find a way to make people pay for quality information. And at the grassroots level, that's hard to do. People at grassroots don't have a lot of money and don't often know they need quality information.
But yeah, so if I can just come back to that at the end of the day, it's just actually the question of how do you pay for good news? So do you see that with the emergence of, let's say, alternate spaces like Dalit Camera in India, or News Laundry, or even the more online like The Wire, Scroll, do you see kind of a more inclusive picture of what constitutes news, whether it's local, global, or very hyper local? Do you see it coming together now?
Yes, I mean, it certainly means that anyone can be a news provider. The difficulty is making any money out of that. And it almost appears that the more outrageous you are, the more successful in monetary terms you may be. You may find ways of monetizing your outrageous statements. So I don't think certainly Dalit Camera isn't making any money, I'd have thought, and I suspect The Wire, Scroll, the online sites in India, none of them would be rolling in the kind of money that the old print system used to generate. I mean, even 20 years ago in Australia, the Saturday newspapers were referred to as rivers of gold, because they had literally hundreds of pages of classified advertisements. And that's what, of course, allowed big expense accounts for journos who liked long lunches. And that was perhaps one of the less admirable aspects. But what I think is important here is also the democratizing of news through digital media. The fact that Black Lives Matter wouldn't have happened without smartphones. It was the fact that some of this awful behavior is now being broadcast to the world. That's the upside if one's idealizing truth and accountability. But just how you manage to take that down to the level of a small town in Andhra Pradesh, which once would have made money for Ramoji Rao's Enadu because of its good little local edition that went in with Enadu. How you do that now is much more difficult when you can get everything you need in that small town on your smartphone.
Yeah, but also I think during the pandemic, two things were very clear. I mean, I was there until last year, that local journalists were becoming literally the first people who were going out there giving us the news. They were, and now we see that a proliferation of people who are using social media as well as technology to tell us where we can go if we need a hospital bed, that kind of thing. So I think, yeah, any reflections on that?
Well, as I say, it's the digital information world is a bit like fire. It's a wonderful device when you can control when it's used wisely, and but it also has this terrible ability to do some pretty awful things in spreading misinformation. And then, of course, you immediately run up against the question, well, your misinformation is my information. It's very democratic in that way. But you'd have to say that poor people are better off by having the ability to use a 4G kind of phone or media instrument than they would be without it. There's certainly a strength there. And I guess in an ideal world, within a generation, people will have begun to realize, the large majority of people, the dangers of accepting anything that comes in on your screen as being the truth, and the ability to look behind, to ask questions. But at the moment, there's an amazing global naivete that exposes, or it enables a great many lie peddlers and crazy story peddlers to gain traction that they don't deserve. And I'd like to think in another generation, that kind of activity will be scoffed at, because the users will just be that much smarter about how to use the devices that give them a certain power.
Yeah, if I can just use what you've said about certain kinds of peddlers of what we call, fake news and that kind of, that has become so important in politics, in contemporary politics. It's just impossible to get away from it. Do you think that this kind of populist politics has had some influence over the last, let's say, since we've learned about the pandemic? Do you think it has had some kind of influence over how pandemics have been handled across the world?
Certainly, it ought to. It makes it easier to communicate with very large numbers of people fairly directly. But at the same time, it also allows inject some bleach into your veins and it will help you to cure COVID. It allows those sorts of stories to travel widely as well. And again, it comes down to the user on how discriminating they are, how able they are both in time and in knowledge to go behind what they're reading. I think certainly what, in my view, the strength of both the Trump Republicans and the amazing party mechanism that the BJP has built would not have been possible without the mobile phone. It takes other things as well. I mean, I wouldn't attribute all this to simply digital technology, but digital technology has enabled that kind of organization with a story that appeals to very large numbers of people to be built and reinforced on a very daily basis.
Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting that you talk of digital technology, and this is something that Veena Das, exactly about a year ago, around this time, April, she was on a webinar that Tata Institute of Social Sciences had organized, and she said something very interesting. She said most countries are looking at this virus in biological terms. They're looking at it, how do we contain it, that it is the job of doctors and scientists to figure out what is the antibodies and all of that. Very few are looking at it as social scientists ought to, how does it impact communities and all of that. Do you think there's been some reflection on that within academia in Australia, at least?
I would certainly imagine so. There's been recourse to universities in the last year in Australia by mainstream media, almost daily, they're finding experts of one kind or another to comment on developments in the COVID universe, if you like, even historians get a bit of a Guernsey because they're invited to go back to 1919 and the flu epidemic every so often. But for example, this morning in Australia, or particularly in the state of Victoria, there's been a certain amount of media on the fact that Melburnians have not been checking into public places the way they should. That is, recording their presence in an environment. Whereas people in New South Wales and Sydney apparently are being terribly well behaved, and you can find where they've been in a very regular kind of disciplined way. And the question is, why is the state of Victoria different from the state of New South Wales? What role is government in this? Is there a kind of deeper cultural meaning here that Sydney people are more cosmopolitan, more aware of the dangers that the world present? Melburnians are much more inward looking, intellectual, and because of the cold weather, they stay indoors more and aren't aware of the dangers that lurk. So that kind of question, and I'm posing it as a kind of joke, but nevertheless, it is a serious question of the kinds that I think sociologists, anthropologists all over the world are asking, and particularly those that would identify themselves as medical sociologists or medical anthropologists or even political scientists on how you generate the politics that create a health system that is capable of dealing with some things very, very well. The Brits seem to have done very well in vaccinating people, even though they did very poorly, you'd have to guess, because of political leadership leading up to their ability to roll out vaccine in large numbers. And similarly, America, look at the American record now in the last 3 months in vaccination has been spectacular. They claim 100 million people have been vaccinated. That's more than a third of all Americans, including the young children. So I think the social sciences in some ways are being valued in ways that they often aren't, simply because I think now most people would recognize this is not just a technological matter. It's not just a tech fix. It has to be a much broader human relations sort of solution to this epidemic and to future epidemics. But just on where one research leads to another, my friend Asi is now chasing superbugs. He's become very interested in micro-resistant, antimicro drugs, the bugs that are capable of overcoming antibiotics. So that's where this waste inquiry has led him. But also very relevant to the current question, because this is not the last pandemic.
Of course, which allows me, Robin, to ask you, segue into the final question. Where do you see the future of social science research, both in Australia and in India, as we move from one episode to another, and through such a life-changing moment as we're going through right now?
Certainly in Australia, it's more and more likely, I think, to involve things that have what appear to have direct policy relevance. I've been very lucky throughout my career to be able to research what interested me, and I think maybe important topics too. But today, it's even for an academic beginning a career in a university or a college, it's even more important to be taking up topics that can be clearly presented as having some sort of social utility. And I think that in a way is a pity, because we often, just as in the hard sciences, we often don't know what might be useful farther along, and where a particular line of what looks like not very relevant to contemporary needs sort of inquiry, where that may lead. But I think that's certainly the case now. Anybody who's doing a PhD in Australia will feel that pressure to take up a topic that looks directly relevant to some sort of aspect of contemporary life. Well, that's all right, but it's not the only way to begin to learn the skills of research and prosecute research.
Thank you so much, Robin. It's been wonderful speaking to you. Thank you for your time. And I hope you get to travel again soon because you have commitments elsewhere in the world.
Yes, I do too, but I don't think I'm betting on it for the rest of 2021.
Yeah, well, on that note, Robin, thank you very much once again. You have a wonderful day.
Thanks for having me, Sanjay. Enjoyed it very much. Thank you.